Welcome everyone to the Omega Conversation Series. I'm Michael Kraft, Program and Business Development Strategist for Omega, and I'm very honored to welcome these two speakers to our conversation. Jon Kabat-Zinn, PhD, is a scientist, writer, and meditation teacher, internationally known for his work with mindfulness practice, especially mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, bringing it into the mainstream of medicine, healthcare, and society. He is Professor of Medicine Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, where he founded the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society. Jon's books are in print in more than 40 languages and include Full Catastrophe Living, Where You Go, There You Are, and Coming to Our Senses. And Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams Sensei is an author, activist, spiritual teacher, and founder of the Center for Transformative Change. She has been bridging the worlds of personal transformation and justice since the publication of her critically acclaimed book, Being Black, Zen and the Art of Living with Fearlessness and Grace, hailed as an act of love by Alice Walker. Co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, Angel urges all communities to have the conversations necessary to become more aware of what hinders liberation of self and society. Today, they're going to be speaking on love and awakening in a time of global pandemic. They'll lead us in a practice, they'll speak, and then they'll take as many of our questions as possible. Thank you, and welcome, Angel and Jon.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
And welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm taking a quick moment to turn the screen over to the grid view where I can see the many people calling in, but it was signing in from wherever you are. It's really great to see your faces. I'd love to just be here, and I'm really very, very happy to be here in this conversation with Jon. And I think we can just jump right in.
Yeah, well, I second that emotion, and I could get really lost screening through all the thumbnails, but I won't do that. But to just say it's wonderful that you have gathered here with us, really to support Omega and also to support, of course, the major issues that are facing us in the world today in the midst of this global pandemic that nobody anticipated, but certain people did anticipate, but nobody paid attention. So, I'm just delighted to be here with Reverend Angel, who I don't know all that well, but I have very high esteem for. And we thought that it would be fun to, since we're both really into meditation as a liberative practice, and one that, doesn't pull any punches when it comes to naming the actuality of things. Yeah. And we thought it would be fun to be in conversation together, maybe a little bit of guided meditation, and to just see if it weren't possible to investigate together what holds us back in this country and in our society from really being our fully who we are, every single one of us as members of this society. And there are endemic ways in which we have been blind to enormous degrees of pain and suffering in this world. And the COVID-19 pandemic could be seen as a wake-up call for us as human beings, not just as Americans, but as human beings, to sort of finally get it right before we wind up destroying not just the planet, but everything we care about, including our own, families and the well-being of everybody, if we don't learn the lessons that history has been trying to teach us for a very long time. And maybe there's some progress, but maybe this is a time of real opening.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about, and I just want to take a moment and say I really appreciate Omega inviting us to do this, and feel very connected to the Omega community at large, and certainly the Omega staff. And so it's really an honor to be here, and it's certainly an honor to be here with you, Jon. And it feels like we get into spaces that are in close proximity together. So to have this opportunity to have a conversation, and even in our pre-conversation, just finding that there is a lot of synchronicity. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is just the awareness that in whatever one could call the meditation sphere, or how it kind of unfolds, there may be a lot of people that think that we're somewhat opposites, right? I mean, there's some real very straightforward apparent opposites about us, right? Myself as a Black female, you as a white male teacher, you really at the onset of mindfulness movement, and I'm kind of pulling up the back of the continuing lineage and stream that's coming forward right now. And yet the fact that we both are leaning into and have been leaning into meditation as not just a technique and not just something that you do to entertain yourself, but really as a liberative practice, as you said, I find incredible alignment with the ways in which we are looking at this particular crisis and what it can make available to us in terms of information, in terms of learning, in terms of the things that we need to unknow, or we could go back to sleep. And I think often we are presented with opportunities in such a way in our lives, and it's really, I've been saying it's a koan for me. Koan is considered like a Zen riddle, that we are in this place with this pandemic where we are both called into a kind of collective awakening, and simultaneously that collective awakening, or the potential for that collective awakening, is coming as the result of something that is putting us in different and distant physical distance from each other. And there's a real something really profound about the togetherness, right? The sort of we are all being touched by this in varying degrees, and varying degrees of burden, certainly, but all being touched and aware and holding awareness of this crisis and what is befalling the human human society and race, but we're also being compelled to contend with it in individual or isolated groupings from each other. And so there's something very, it feels very profound, and I feel the sort of dynamic tension of that.
Yeah, I feel it similarly. And just the fact that as I look at my screen, it's like almost 900 people have tuned into this conversation is emblematical of something I think that's very, very positive, as is Omega itself, in terms of trying to sort of be a place where people can actually discover the full dimensionality of who we are as human beings and what we are. And that doesn't stop at the envelope of our skin. It goes out. And very often when we're talking about mindfulness, I think that it's really important for us to be mindful of dimensions of pain and suffering that, depending on all sorts of factors, we may not be that aware of, because our awareness, although it's supposed to be boundless, actually is quite conditioned and limited sometimes. So I would say, just to jump right in a certain way, and I do want to sort of have a formal guided meditation, but I think in a certain way we could say that this entire conversation is meant to be a guided meditation, or a collective inquiry, so to speak, into and deep dive into what it means to be human, the nature of awareness, and can we inhabit what's deepest and best in ourselves, not as a technique or a method of getting somewhere else, but actually of realizing the full dimensionality of who and where we are and what we are right now, and therefore move forward in the world in ways that actually are not necessarily always comfortable, but that stretch the envelope of the places where our ignorance is profound, but we could easily fall into saying that, oh no, I've got that covered. So I'll just, for example, I'll just throw out from myself that in terms of, say, privilege, for instance, I never gave privilege a thought until I was about 74 years old. And I'm 75 now. And it never occurred to me that my life was actually colored by and shaped and propelled in a certain way by barriers that I didn't have to face by virtue of my skin color, for instance, or my parents, or where I was born, or a whole range of factors that I just took to be like, that's the way the world is and totally normal. And then everything that I may have accomplished, I did on my own. And it took me 75 years or 74 years to realize that ain't necessarily so. Right. That all sorts of things reduced barriers, presented opportunities for me that actually shaped everything about my life. And that's not equally true for everybody in this society, even though we talk about it as if it is. Yeah. And so I think these conversations about race and racializing and racism and a profound ignoring of the ways that we may cause harm either by omission or by commission. It's not merely by commission, but sometimes it's like by not paying attention, we're actually collaborating and causing harm. This goes way beyond race too, because it's true in the political scene we find ourselves in now, that there's every avenue. And of course, with global warming and the environmental change and loss of the glaciers. So waking up is not a matter of, well, I'll wake up to what I feel comfortable with. But what about waking up to what we really don't feel comfortable with, and then see how attached we are and how angry we could get or frightened we can get at dealing with the other that we don't know but fear.
Yeah. That's the core of the work that I really felt compelled to bring forward with my work with Radical Dharma. Because as a woman that's Black, identified, and queer, and have been deepened in these traditions, what I could see is the presence of so much power and potential for liberation, the real deep practices that allow us to really come into contact with, to confront in ways that are opening and also surprising for ourselves, but ultimately, if we, stick with our practice and we're willing to do this investigation, we really have this profound opportunity to find, who we really are. But in order to do that, we have to come into confrontation with, and therefore, how have we been conditioned? So there is this sort of profound who I am, but there is also the conditioning. And then where does that conditioning come from? There's conditioning in my family. There's conditioning in society. And to your point, it's not just that certain people have privilege, and that goes along, beyond race, as you said, but around gender, around class. The class is enormous and impacting us, enormously in the world, especially right now, right? People's socioeconomic class, like the virus may not know boundaries and borders, but it certainly knows how to travel along the structures of systems that have been put in place, such that the burden of the virus is falling upon certain peoples in inequitable ways. And when I was part of these, so many meditation communities, that I both love the profound practice and people's intention and desire to have peace, but also found that there was a deep reluctance to actually navigate the social conditioning, right? To kind of imagine that one was outside of social conditioning, that I could just take up, I'm going to find myself, and I'm going to, go deeply and find myself, but not the parts that are uncomfortable for me. I'm not going to deal with what it means that I contract or get restricted or pull back, or am trying to control the room when and when a colored person is in the meditation space and they're showing up in a way that isn't according to what we think the rules are, or how that should happen. So there's a lot there, and this is sort of not just an idle thought, but these same conditions have put us in confrontation with navigating a global pandemic, and the recognition that we could simply try to turn the clock back and figure out, well, how do I go back to my life? Or as you said, we could use this time with practice, with this increased awareness of who are we really, right? Who am I? Who have I been? What is mine? And what has just been, given to me, or how have the waters been parted for me, so that I can see a way forward that allows me to be more fully who I intend to be, rooted in the love that I say that I'm about, but actually doing that with some really fierce honesty.
How beautifully articulated. So is there a meditation? Because, we could talk for hours about this, and I can see all the different ways in which we can get into it and really investigate all of the different ways that we can pretend that we're awake and actually be caught up in the sleep, or self-identify in ways that are limiting. Mm-hmm. Because the self ultimately winds up being a challenging dimension of investigation, that is like, who's meditating, who was even brought to this, who wants liberation, and what is your view of liberation, and is it for me, myself, or is it for all beings? And is that just a cheapo way of saying something that you don't really understand the depth of when we say all beings? So these are like,
when we say all beings, we mean all beings.
Exactly. But sometimes we don't behave that way.
Right.
So this is where the rubber meets the road for me in terms of formal and informal meditation practice, because if we're not living our understanding and stretching the envelope of where we're most blind, and of course, where we're most blind, we can't see. Right. So we need each other to point out to us, or to challenge us, or to even sort of call us on certain blindnesses that we're incapable of seeing. And of course, families function that way, but we're all part of the human family. And there's so much pain in society because we've never actually swallowed, never mind digested, the original genocide here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And also the mind-blowing legacy of enslaving peoples for so many centuries, and then benefiting economically because you bring up class, driving the economy of the United States of America on the labor of people who were basically enslaved. And
on the land of people that it was stolen from.
Exactly. And we're the home of the,
land of the free,
land of the free and the home of the brave. Right. So there's a certain disconnect between the rhetoric and the actuality. And for me, healing, coming from a medical perspective, is not fixing or curing. Healing is coming to terms in the most profound of ways with the actuality of things. But unless you investigate the actuality of things, you'll be fooled by your own attachments to where your comfort zones, or those stories or narratives you want to build about it, including the narrative, the triumphalist narrative of American history. And we see it in every press conference that's being put out daily about the story about how we're handling the virus. Most of it is like just a story, and everybody sees that it's a story. So this is a wonderful object lesson in itself, because without the direct perception that meditative awareness really gives us, hey, everybody's trapped in the story of me.
Right. One of the things that I often think about is, it's fairly simple. If we look around, this has been kind of the opening for me, and it came directly out of my practice, is well, if that's not my condition, if I'm of this condition, of this reality, if I'm in the position in which, I have access to food and clean water, I have a home over my head, why is that person, uh, why am I not of their condition where they're homeless or where they're on the streets or they're addicted to drugs? Like, is it true that somehow, right? So either I end up with, I'm just better, what I mean? And I did more work, I worked harder,
Right.
and I see so many people, migrant workers, people that are, hourly workers, labor workers, many of the people that can't afford to be home and can't afford to be, sitting here on a call, listening to us prattle on. They have to be out there, even though they're putting their lives on the line and their health in danger. Is it that I somehow work hard? I just don't believe that. And I think that one of the things that being a person that has been marginalized historically is that I'm not so deeply entrenched in the belief that of an automatic entitlement to whatever the conditions that I have,
Right.
that like I have somehow made them all. I'm so profoundly aware and made even more aware by my meditation practice of a confluence of events, of something that's kind of like luck and seizing opportunity and the right time and the right moment, but also the way that the path has been parted for me, even in my, in the sort of social sphere. We could say I have less opportunity than you, or it wasn't structured for me. But there are still ways that, just my command of the English language, and the color of my skin, and, a sense of I'm safe, right? One looks upon me and I'm not necessarily the most threatening of the others. I'm not apparently Muslim or any other things, or Sikh, or I'm not a big black man with dark skin, or all of these ways that we have encoded into our dialogue about what is threatening, and it's not just that I took advantage of those ways. It's that as I was able to make opportunity for myself, there's less opportunity for other people, because the systems are set up that way so that my advantages are often actually directly connected to other people's disadvantage. For me, that doesn't mean that I will not have advantages, but that I owe something for my time here, right? That I have work to do, that I have payback, that I have to like look over my shoulder and say, oh, these advantages that I have as an American when I walk into foreign countries, that there is something else that I owe in terms of how I show up there and how I be there and the position and role I take, so that I'm listening and learning and I'm willing to interrogate and investigate what is actually true here.
And one of the things I love about you is that one of the many things that is that you have this training in the Zen tradition, which at its best, the Zen tradition is really about transcending name and form and non-attachment. And yet it's cutting through to the essence of things, but then not shying away from that essence and the reality that prevents us from tasting that essence, no matter who we are. And so there's a certain way in which that tradition really calls us to, again, wake up to what we most don't see. And we need each other to, in the Zen tradition, they sometimes bop you over the head, to like wake you up, because you can get super attached to Zen or Buddhism or my view of my, wakefulness or whatever. And it's all about I, me, and mine, which is the whole point, is that I wake up to that and understand something about the we. And how big is the we the people in the Constitution? Well, is it we, some of the people? Are we the privileged people? Are we the property owners? And when you start to look at...
we that have a passport, or we that, didn't, cross a border at a particular time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
we, the humans that converge in a certain time and in a certain place. And how are we going to move forward? So, my sense is that we're at the beginning of a potential what I call orthogonal rotation in consciousness. Those are big MIT words, but the notion is
I
that
love that phrase, by the way. I
if
love
we,
that.
the notion is that if we just keep on doing the same old, then in a certain way, we'll still be attached to our stories and there'll still be the separation, and we can make up stories of incremental progress and that everything's going in the right direction. But an orthogonal rotation in consciousness is actually an invitation to wake up right in this moment to another dimension in which we can see what before we couldn't see so well. And that's because we're listening to each other and we're observing in ways that we're conditioned not to see, not to observe, as you've been pointing out. And then the question is, how does one practice in that way? How does one live one's life so that we're not shying away from or pulling back from what that calling is, and at the same time we're not burning ourselves out with some kind of misguided messianic kind of immediacy that turns off everybody that we most want to.
And urgency. And I think this, when I think about the pandemic is, there's a lot of, awareness of like, oh, wow, there are things that are really, really wrong. And, as you said, people are sort of, skirting the awakening of what is wrong, being able to see, mountains that we essentially gave up on the idea of, being able to see because of, climate change and,
Exactly.
the destruction of the climate. And then, having literally the awakening that comes from the seeing and saying like, oh, they're in the mountains and, they're gorgeous and they're beautiful and they're powerful. And now what do I do with this? And so, I feel people really trying to figure out like, and so now what do I do with this? And as we're having this conversation, I can imagine there are people I see, questions are popping up on the chat, and people often go immediately to the what can I do about this? And I think therein lies the paradox of, the meeting together of a practice, right, and action in the world. And maybe I'm hearing something about that initial question about the koan of like, because so we have this collective touching, but because we're not together, we actually can't really do. And that's a profound teacher, right? That we are being compelled to like just sit with it.
You mean in this moment?
In this moment, right? And so there's an awakening, and we sort of like
sheltering.
Well, yeah, and because we're sheltering in place, we're not going to go out and do a big protest, and so we're really being compelled to sit with not just the awareness that's dawning of us of the inequities and how this could really be a turning point for us, but we're also, I think, being compelled to sit with our sense of urgency, right, and how we navigate the difference between the impulse towards ending suffering, right, which is, compassion, what compassion is, how we sit with the impulse, the difference, the distinction between an urgency to kind of get out of the discomfort of that confrontation, right, and allow real, true compassion and the wisdom of what is mine to do to arise. I think that sweet spot, I feel that.
Well, we're all on retreat together, and the problem is that a lot of people have not had the benefit of a lot of retreat experience. You and I have, so we, in some sense, know how to make use of this time that we are sequestered, and a lot of it has to do with we have to be at home, right? If you're not one of the first responders or in some way or other helping to bring food or to take care of things, we're acting in a compassionate way to help mitigate the virus by staying home and not doing what we usually do. So that's a retreat conditions where we're being invited to be. And of course, if things are very complicated in one way or another in your location, whether it's having to have the kids home all the time and not, so we're really it's like a laboratory of observing oneself and seeing that this is an incredible opportunity to actually see how maybe our rhetoric around liberation is very different from how we actually present ourselves in everyday life with the environments that we're in. And so if there's some way in which we can cultivate mindfulness during this time and use this entire time as a retreat, so to speak, to help us wake up to what we most don't see or feel, and we have lots of opportunities to do that, then there's a certain way in which when we come back, the world will never be the same after this pandemic. There are lessons to be learned here, one way or another, that absolutely have to learn, including, as you mentioned, the fact that even susceptibility to the toxicity of the virus and the dangers associated with the virus, that's related to race. That's related to, and not because of race itself, but how health disparities, how many health disparities there are in the society on the basis of race and access to healthcare
and housing, and access to
housing,
access to food that is
exactly
health giving food and thriving food. Yeah, I think what you're saying here. Really, the question for us collectively is how will we use this time? Rather than putting our attention so far ahead to figuring out how do we get it back, which is what we're hearing from our administration, is like, how do we get it back to the way it was, to really be in the recognition that the way it was immense suffering. And we're seeing that immense suffering exponentially magnified for us in the very, very stark form of death, right? And health and real impact on people. And we can't take that away. Like, we can't just take away the fact that people have died and will continue to die as a result of these disparities, but we can decide for ourselves what is it that we are participating in. Or what is it that, what is our co-mission and what is our own mission that has given rise to contribute to structures that work in this way? But that is really a choice. You said we're all in a retreat. We could be in a retreat, or we could just be, in a box, like, rats, like running around in circles trying to figure out how we're going to get out of here. So even the act of retreating and using this time as retreat is a choice, and it is a liberatory choice. To be willing to use this time to sit with the discomfort rather than to, I'm all for a little bit of Netflix here and there and, catching up on some extra sleep, but can we make a decision for ourselves? Can we decide that that part of our commitment to love is to use this time as awakening?
And that's what we entitled this thing, that it is like, love and awakening. Now, these are not trivial words. They are big words. But I've always felt that the meditation practice itself was a radical act of sanity, to stop and drop in and cultivate the domain of being and the wisdom associated with that. And also learning how to abide in the timeless present moment. So that's like, when we learn how to abide, that is taking refuge, literally and metaphorically, where we're safe, we're out of the winds for this moment. And then, the divine abode, so to speak, or the four immeasurables then become like, loving kindness, compassion, joy in the, the sort of happiness of others, and then equanimity. How do we actually cultivate those? So that when this part of our retreat, the real retreat is, of course, life itself. There's no beginning to it and there's no end to it. So how do we actually make maximal use of this time and cultivate this so that we also formulate an intention, perhaps, which I always like to do coming out of a period of meditation or a retreat, not just dedicating the merit of it, but what is my intention going forward to get out of the I, me, and mine? And the blindness, so to speak, or the feeling of relative safety, and I don't want to risk that. Now, everybody who has ever experienced love knows that love is risky.
Yeah.
It's risky.
And
awareness,
it's not just risky, but it's not possible really without.
Without it. And awareness, the same thing, because you can't be selectively aware.
Right.
So like, then the curriculum gets a lot bigger because you become aware of your own implicit bias, not just other people's bias. You become aware of your own violence, not this other people's violence. You become aware of your own greed, hatred,
your internal,
delusion.
your internal violence, your internal aggression, your internal
Exactly.
systems of oppression, your own domination. I mean, often people ask this question. It's like there's a tendency for us to like go out there, and it's like, yeah, and we have so much disarming. One of the ways I talk about it is disarming to do before we can meaningfully disrupt, because we're so conditioned by the system that even our intentions to do something different ends up actually furthering the systems that we're attempting to
and so
deconstruct.
that is so beautifully said. And again, it's not a concept, what you just said, it's a way of being. And that's what the meditation practice is. It's a way of being. And it's not about the future, it's about the present moment. And in my view, kind of from my experience, if we really want to change the future, the only leverage we have is to live in this moment with the full understanding that you just elaborated. And then all of a sudden, the next moment's different because you were willing to show up in your fullness in this one. And then that influences the next moment. That's the only leverage we ever have over the future. Everything else is just talk, concepts. And if our social activism, sorry.
Yeah, and there are concepts that actually take us away from the present moment, and so, we're attempting to eliminate violence or to mitigate violence, and we're not present to our partner. We're not present,
which is a form of violence.
Which is a form of violence.
But
right.
We'll talk about love and how much we love.
That's exactly.
It really is a kind of koan, as you were saying, to like, what would it mean to totally wake up and to reside, to abide in this present moment as if it really, 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 really mattered. And if suffering was not merely a matter of not seeing the suffering of others, but in actually making your heart so big that you actually experience the suffering of others, but there's no you there, so you don't actually fatigue with that. There's no such thing as compassion fatigue. And it's not like you then have to go out and save the world in some way, which is going to create, sort of a lot of burnout and, sort of, again, promote selfing. To find some kind of, again, I'll use the word orthogonal rotation in consciousness so that we wake up in such a way where we help each other to move towards a wholeness that's already right here. That we don't need to, in some sense, be different from who we are. We need to uncover, discover, and recover who we actually are. And I would maintain that for a very, very large fraction of human beings, that compassion and caring and kindness are innate, as opposed to something. Of course, there are all these bad actors out there, and you can read about them and see them on television every day, sort of trolls and people just trying to cause trouble from Putin on down. But the fact is that I like to put my faith, if you will, in our fundamental goodness as human beings, and then be completely realistic about what that means in terms of defining laws, lawfulness, which is what the word dharma means, in such a way that why don't we create laws that would mitigate greed, mitigate, violence, and not just certain kinds of violence, but the kinds of violence that are systemic, that are social, that are racial, that are economic. And that's the opportunity here. So I'm wondering, because I'm looking at the clock and we want to have some conversation and so forth, whether out of this kind of conversation and all of the incredible work that you've been doing over this time, whether there's not a kind of relatively brief by the clock, timeless meditation that you might lead us in that maybe puts the ground under some of these domains that we've brought up in this very brief conversation. Would that be
Well,
a fair thing
think
to?
about it as it's a brief, and it's more a little bit like a practice, and it's a meditation and kind of it's a contemplation. So practice in that way. And I've really been thinking about it a lot. It came to me in the face of the recognition that we're able to see the sky, right? We're seeing the sky in a different way as a result of the reduced activity, right? And the compelled retreat. And so I think about this practice as taking a sky view is the way that I've been talking about it. And the sky view, it's an acronym, and the first S is S for self-care, right? To actually contemplate what is the thing that you really need to be in care with yourself. Because one of the things I have come to understand in my work is that often what is inhibiting our ability to be really in relationship with the so-called other is the lack of attention and awareness of and care. I don't mean acquiring material stuff, but care for ourselves. So what is that place that is unattended in you,
Mhm.
that is as of yet unmet, unnamed, unseen, unacknowledged, that to presence yourself to that in your meditation practice, in your centering prayer, whatever your practice may be, will allow you to be in a greater degree of ongoing self-care. So that's S for self-care. And then also, what is the thing that you can do that will allow you to be more, have more kindness, right? To extend more kindness first to yourself. Because again, I think that part of what I've really been able to see is that people's ability to be unkind to others has very much to do with an inability to be truly kind to themselves. We
Wow.
mistake selfishness, right, and selfish behavior for somehow like, well, they know how to take care of themselves or like be kind to themselves. No, that's selfishness and self-centeredness, but actually that's a direct result of lack of kindness to oneself. So many of us need to grow more spaciousness to be kind to ourselves. So what is the act of radical kindness that you can have with yourself in this time that you can practice into? What's wonderful is you have day after day. You didn't get it right this day. You can work on it the next day. So maybe that's taking walks. Maybe that's taking more time away from screens. Maybe that is writing down all of the things that you feel overwhelmed by. And so you can really look at those things to create more space for kindness for yourself. And the last one, which is a bit of a paradox, is yearning. And so that last Y is for yearning. And the reason I invoke this is because oftentimes we tend to go to these dichotomies and binaries that get us trapped, where it's like, well, I can't have this, or this is not happening in my life. And so I'll just stoically stay away from it or repress it or suppress it. And I think that repression and suppression of that which we yearn for engenders a great deal of violence within us.
Yeah.
And so if we can acknowledge yearning, which doesn't mean we're going to get it, doesn't mean those things are going to come to fruition or they're ours, or you just because you wrote it down or you said it or you acknowledge it, it's all going to come to pass. But if we acknowledge the yearning, right, we create space for vulnerability and risk, right? The risk of owning that this thing I yearn for, I hope that this thing will, I yearn for us to wake up from this thing and not ever return to where we were before. I yearn for that moment in which they said the printing press is open, that it will stay open so that people will have housing security and food security and healthcare and all of these things. And by damn, the way that I know this country right now, it is unlikely, but I'm going to yearn anyway. Because if I don't allow for that yearning, then I will allow an aggression to be repressed and held down in my belly. So taking a sky view.
I love that. That's really beautiful. Why don't we all just like rest in that big sky embrace for a moment?
And really allow ourselves to be in that space of boundlessness with each of those practices, right? To let them go wherever they may go, knowing that the sky is boundless and it can hold all of our deep yearning for self-care, our hope and our wishes for kindness, and our own yearnings, and the yearnings that we have on behalf of humanity, but on behalf of our families, the yearning that we have to end suffering. It's boundless. It can be held by the sky.
And that, of course, is a metaphor for awareness itself, the sky-like boundless spaciousness of awareness itself, which is not something that you have to get. It's something that is already your true nature in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And what meditation, formal meditation practice does is basically gives us more ready access to that sky-like boundless wakefulness and love that really invites us to be everything that we are, as opposed to believing in the diminished narratives that we have or are not even willing to realize about ourselves. And so, as you were suggesting, project it out onto everybody else and then cause an awful lot of harm and suffering out of just not caring and not being kind to oneself.
Yeah, and the paradox there, and I really want to say something about the paradox, because when you say like we really find who we are, it's like we find who we are. We find who we are and through our meditation practice, formal practice, and we find that is our self-nature. We find that boundlessness is our self-nature. We found that boundless love and possibility and that desire, that fervent desire to end suffering is our self-nature, but our self-nature is also there with, smallness and contraction and pettiness and limited and comparing mind. We find that too. And the idea is not to say, oh, I'm this boundless, spacious, self-nature that is, compassionate and all of these, and oh, those things are not so much. Or that we get over obsessed with, wow, how terrible I am. I can see all of these, petty things and anger and judgment and all of those things. But the boundlessness is actually about to hold the complexity of those two, right? To really hold the complexity of the so-called dichotomies of our spaciousness and boundlessness, and also our very, very on the ground, limited, small ways that we can get caught up with ourselves. And the paradox is that and how we really know who we are is when we recognize that the boundlessness can hold the smallness. The boundlessness has room for it. It has room for us to breathe into the fullness of that, and out of that, and there's no way to tell you, right?
Keep going.
Out of that, what arises is the wisdom of how to hold that complexity. And to show up in the complexity so that I'm not a this or a that. I'm not a either or, it's not in order to be peaceful. I have to, disappear the fact that I have violence and aggression arising me, just to my children. That surprises me, or my partner. And so why am I surprised that I have violence and aggression that shows up in someone that I've been programmed by society to think is threatening? We can hold that, but we don't hold it in our theoretical mind. We will never be able to hold it in our theoretical mind. We hold it through the wisdom and the practice of how we really sit down and show up and abide in the truth of this moment. I think that
Can we just rest here for a few moments and bathe in what was just offered? Because you articulated something that I think is really universally true for us as human beings. And when we don't recognize it, then we create more suffering for ourselves and for each other, and fall into dualisms about us versus them and othering of all kinds. And we're this close to actually always this close to owning the full dimensionality of who we are, including all the shadow stuff and that we don't want to look at, rather than projecting it onto all the bad people who are doing the same thing to us.
Mm-hmm.
So this is very inspiring to me. I'm myself I knew I'd be inspired by participating in a conversation with you about this kind of thing, because this is, in some sense, articulating what could become a broad-based engagement on the part of all of us to grow the world that we can grow in, all of us, and to take care of everybody in ways that are healing and that honor everybody's beauty. And I don't mean that in some kind of Hollywood romantic way, but just as you were framing it, that longing, that yearning.
And the healing that comes from not making it go away, but from meeting it, taking the whole of it in.
And the fundamental message being that you're already okay, that whatever you think is wrong with you, it pales in comparison to what's right with you in any given moment. But when we pour energy into what's wrong with us, or we just fall into those kinds of habits, then we perpetuate greed, hatred, and delusion and harm. But when we learn to abide in what's right with us, then we cause less harm. And we're more aware of our biases and our selfing and all of those other things that get in the way. So I'm wondering whether...
And simultaneously, as we accept deeply who we are and that like we're okay as we are, simultaneously, and this is the paradox, what arises is, and I can give more, offer more, I can work with this, I can work with this. It's really a paradox that as we accept ourselves exactly as we are, that a wisdom arises that then inspires what work there is to do, what there is. So one could say, well, if I'm okay how I am, why do I don't have to do anything? I just sit back here. But that's not.
See if we.
Yeah, doesn't come out of a practice. That's a theoretical, right? I'm okay as I am, so I don't have to do anything. So you're practicing into a lived and embodied experience of the deep okayness as you are.
Well, may this touch people far and wide from this moment on. Really is the invitation for both real love and awakening.
Angel, John, this has been very moving and very appreciated. We're so grateful. A deep bow to both of you and everyone on this call. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Omega.
And may Omega make it through this difficult time intact and continue to thrive going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Carol and Callie and all of and Michael and all of the folks that made this happen technologically. Yeah. Thank you, John.
And Reverend Angel, thank you. I mean, this has really been heartwarming for me personally, just to connect with you in this way. And I feel very much like it's an ongoing adventure.
Yeah. And we do it again.
Mm-hmm. I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Meanwhile, you. Everybody be well. Okay. Stay safe. And the world needs every single one of us to really show up.